It smelled like rot. Rot, bodies, men who were in the throes of the last of their lives, with nothing left to live for and nothing to give. It smelled of all things surrendered, of honor destroyed, and of defeat. Whenever he smelled this scent, that rotten, moist scent that seemed to bleed from the very walls, it always smelled of death to him. It smelled of hopelessness. The tower was part of one castle, a massive and rambling structure that was the predominant feature of the sprawling, dirty town of Rouen. This particular tower had been just another tower housing prisoners from the ongoing wars between France and England, although this particular castle belonged to the English as their stronghold. Therefore, the prisoners were French, but this tower held one special prisoner in particular. It had for 6 months. The 3-storied tower had never really had a name before that time, but now it had a very identifying name: Tour de la Pucelle, Tower of the Maid. The knight stood just inside the entry to the tower, gazing at the semi-spiral staircase that hugged the wall to his right, leading to the floors above. She was up there, and he could feel a palpable sense of dread in his heart. He didn't want to be here, yet he couldn't stay away. He had been there when the English had paid the Burgundians for their very special prisoner, Jean la Pucelle, and it was he, at the Duke of Bedford's instruction, who had ultimately taken the rather short, skinny woman dressed in rags into custody. In fact, as he had gotten a good look at her, he could hardly believe this was the same woman who had been leading the Dauphin's men against the English, and largely succeeding. She was small and thin, and looked like a boy with her short-cropped hair. But behind those dark eyes were the heart, mind, and soul of a lion. He had seen her roar. He had spent the past 6 months watching her roar, watching this illiterate farm girl debate religion with men who considered themselves highly educated and highly clever. She had roared for certain, but her roar had taken the shape of a brilliant statement or a calm debate that had left the arrogant clergy speechless. The big knight, the biggest and most powerful knight in the stable of the man who hated the maid the most, the Duke of Bedford, had been at every proceeding, watching these religious fools try to tear down the young woman who had steadfastly stood by her statement that God spoke to her through St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Mary. She had never wavered, not once, even when men who thought they knew better than she did tried to trap her. But they could never trap the lion. So they had shamed her, tormented her, illegally denied her what the law said was her right. The knight knew, because he had stood by and watched it all, losing more respect for his liege by the day. Bedford was crafty. God, the man was crafty. And he had an unnatural hatred for the maid. The mind games, the deceit, went on for months, and in the end, the ecclesiastical court coerced the maid into signing a confession in exchange for life in prison. But that wasn't good enough for Bedford. He wanted the witch dead. But there was a problem with that wish. The knight, who had been Bedford's right hand through all of his campaign for Henry VI's rights in France, had begun to show distinct signs of sympathy towards the maid. Every man in the English army was afraid of this knight, the man called the Beast, up to and including Bedford. Sir Bastien de Russe had virtually kept England's army going against the onslaught from the maid and her supporters, so it wouldn't do well to anger de Russe, or even let him know that you were thinking anything other than kind thoughts about him. De Russe had the power to make it so one no longer existed. He'd been known to wipe out entire families that displeased him. Therefore it was unwise to enrage the man. He would simply quash you. But de Russe had shown definite symptoms of compassion towards the maid over the past few months, even going so far as to kill 3 guards accused of attempting to rape her. One of the conditions of her confession had been to resume wearing women's clothing in prison. Wearing men's clothing was an offence to God, and she had avoided the heresy charge by agreeing to wear women's clothing, and no longer the chainmail or clothing she wore in battle against the English. Bedford knew the only solution to his troubles would be to get the woman back into men's clothing. He could then declare she had gone back on her word. It would negate her signed confession. She would be charged with heresy, condemned to die, and his problem would be solved. It was not so easy to do that, however, with de Russe seeing to it that the maid was fairly treated.